So today we are very happy to have Els Weinans from Utrecht University. She's the assistant professor at the Copernicus Institute for Sustainable Development at Utrecht. And she did her PhD from Weinans and then did a postdoc at Eindhoven, right? Yes. And today she would be telling us about her work on drivers of polarization and consensus. So yeah, the stage is all yours.
Thank you very much. And thank you for inviting me. And thank you all for being here. It's a pleasure to be here. So today I would like to tell you a little bit about this work on polarization and consensus that I did together with George van Voorn, Patrick Steinman, Elisa Perona, and Amadresa Marandi. The first two are from Wageningen University and the last two are from Eindhoven University. So before I start, I would like to mention that I really welcome questions as I go. So if you have any point for discussion or a question, don't wait until the end. Just interrupt me and then we can talk about it. Yeah, that's it. So first, I will tell you a little bit about me and my background. So I did a bachelor's in Beta Gamma at the University of Amsterdam. So this is basically a combination of all natural and social sciences. So that's a little bit too broad, of course. So I had to choose a major, and then I chose for ecology and evolution. And I took my first steps into modeling at a course from André de Roos, actually. So he got me.
Why?
Yeah, so after my bachelor's, I actually called myself a biologist, but that didn't last very long because then I did a master's in computational science, still at the University of Amsterdam. And there I realized that I actually really liked the more abstract way of thinking and the more analytical way of thinking. So I wanted to learn more about this. So then I got the opportunity after that to do a PhD at Wageningen University. And this was in the aquatic ecology department. So there was some biology involved, but the money came from a climate grant. So there was also some climate related stuff involved. And the topic was on multivariate resilience indicators, which I think is mostly applied mathematics. So somewhere in the middle of all of that, I did my PhD. And then at the end of my PhD, COVID hit. So I had some plans to go abroad, but those were all cancelled. So I decided to do a postdoc at Eindhoven University, although I go there very often, of course, because we couldn't go anywhere. And there I studied uncertainty quantification of agent-based models, and that's also what I want to talk about today. And then at the end of my postdoc, I got hired as an assistant professor for modeling global environmental change at the Copernicus Institute of Sustainable Development at Utrecht University. So that's also where I met Svanendu. And yeah, it's a very nice institute. So as you can see also from my background, I really like interdisciplinary stuff. And at the Copernicus Institute, everybody is also doing very interdisciplinary stuff. So that's very nice. And I think also here at the Institute for Advanced Studies, that's what you guys like as well, I hope. So it's nice to be here. So the inspiration for the project came that at the end of my PhD, I was working quite a lot with this Ising spin model. And the idea there was that I was trying to conceptualize resilience and complexity, and then also in spatial domains. And I realized that this Ising spin model helped me to explain the point. I guess most of you know the Ising spin model, right? I see some nodding. So in this model, we work on a regular grid. So there are cells next to each other. And then dependent on the neighbors of every cell, they try to adapt the color to their neighbors. So here cells can be either +1 or -1, black or white. And then if there's a black cell surrounded by white cells, then it also wants to align to the white cells. And at the next point in time, it probably flips. And then there's this very important parameter, the temperature. And it basically says something about the level of stochasticity in the model. So if the temperature is very high, then basically all the cells just flip at random, and then we're looking at a random grid. And when the temperature is very low, then all the cells really try to align with each other, and we end up with a completely black or completely white grid. And in the middle, there is something going on. So here we are not in a completely ordered phase where the system moves to one color, but we are also not completely in a disordered phase because it's definitely not random what we see here. So there are some clusters and some patterns. And this is one definition that people sometimes use for complexity. So they say that in the middle of the complete order and the complete disorder is where complexity peaks. So in that way, it helped me to explain what I meant with complexity. And then during COVID, it was particularly interesting because I saw around in my own social network that some conversations were a little bit hard to have. I don't know if you experienced that as well. But also in my own network, things sometimes became a little bit polarized. It became some topics that I could not talk about to everybody anymore when it came to vaccinations or the restrictions to social life. And actually this Ising spin model is also used to explore opinion dynamics. So there people could either be for something or against something, and that's the +1 and the -1. And then you can see how those opinions may spread through a population.
I can ask a quick question.
Yes.
Before you continue, you mentioned that in the middle there was this complexity, but you didn't define complexity here. Are you going to do that, or so? What do you mean exactly that it's more complex? It looks certainly more fluctuating, but is that the same as complexity? And that's a philosophical question.
I actually don't want to go into the details because we could probably talk about that for many hours. And there are many different definitions, but most of the definitions, they relate to this a little bit. So they say that for a system to be complex, there have to be some long-range correlations. So it shouldn't be completely random, but there should be something interesting going on. So it shouldn't be completely black or completely white. But how exactly to quantify what is going on here is quite difficult. So
if you say long-range correlations, I agree. I think that's
there is a definition in physics, but you have a critical point, and that's where you heard divergence of correlation lengths.
yeah, that's a lot.
And we know that there is a critical slowing down. So if you want to match this, because I think models come from physics, it's good to see what these concepts exactly like when you find.
There is also some definition information too, and that will be related to the fact that your susceptibility is averaging at the critical point.
yeah,
The susceptibility matrix, which is the future information matrix for that system, is diverging. So the system is very susceptible around the critical point, and it's really complex.
Yeah, basically, you have critical exponents for different quantities.
Yeah, these are definitely all definitions that we could map, and also this Ising spin model really allows us to quantify this quite easily. But if you do not have the equations, then sometimes you need different types of indicators, and then it can become a little bit more complicated. But they all relate to the processes that you mentioned. So an increased sensitivity, a critical slowing down. Those are often properties of complexity. But there are many different definitions, and actually, for my point, it doesn't really matter that much. Sorry, I would like to leave that for now. So if I map this model to opinion dynamics, I think an important thing that was missing there is that in this Ising spin model, people just adapt their opinion based on the people who are around them. But it doesn't actually matter which person this is, right? They don't have any other information other than the opinion of their neighbors. And we thought that in the real world, it's actually quite important who is sending the information. So who is telling the story? That helps in whether or not you believe the story. So we decided to start with this Ising spin model, but then expand on it a little bit. So instead of binary yes or no opinions, so either -1 or +1, we decided to make it continuous. So opinions could be anywhere in between -1 and +1. And instead of on a regular grid, we worked on a dynamic network. So at first I started on different types of networks, but in the end, I also wanted to explore what is the effect of people breaking links and creating new links. And the last and quite important point, also relating to what I said before, is that the agents only align their opinions based on others that have similar values. And for values, I use this definition from Zoller, and he says that a value is any relatively stable individual level predisposition to accept or reject particular types of arguments. So the idea there is that if, for example, I'm a member of a political party, and then I talk to somebody from a different political party that I do not like at all, that's very opposite of my own political party, and then they tell me something about their holiday destination that I like very much, then I'm likely to think that, well, I don't agree with this person, so probably I also don't like the holiday destination. Even though, of course, it is not exactly related, but I'm more likely to accept opinions from people that share similar values. And the difference between a value and an opinion in my model is that a value changes very slowly, because if the value is your membership to a political party, or maybe your religion, or whether you identify as a scientist. So these are things that can change over a human lifespan, but more often they do not change that often, or they change very slowly. Whereas opinions, they can change more rapidly. So it can be a favorite dish that you have, or a nice holiday destination, something like that. So it can change often in the human lifespan. And in my model, I explicitly make this distinction between values and opinions. And as far as I know, this has not been often done before. So that's a new thing that we added to the model. So in the agent-based model that we constructed, we have this network where the nodes represent individuals, like most opinion dynamics models. And the links here represent social contact. We did not really define what type of social contact. So it can be friendships, but also colleagues or other people that you often talk to. And every agent has an opinion and a value, like I said. And then if the values of two neighbors are similar, and this how similar they are is a parameter that I can choose myself. So if the values are similar, then they adapt their opinions towards each other, and they will converge. But if the values are different, then they actively change their opinion away from that neighbor. And the idea there is that it relates to cognitive dissonance, which means that if you have two beliefs that do not really match up, then this creates a cognitive dissonance in your mind, which is uncomfortable for people. So if you really don't like somebody, then it can be a bit hard to agree with them on something. And to solve this cognitive dissonance that people might feel, it might be easier to shift their opinion, because that's a lot easier to change, right, than to shift their value, because the value is harder to change.
May I ask, so the opinions can change over time, I understand, in this setup, values do not, so people stick to their values?
No, so values do change, but a lot slower than opinions.
So we have two time scales, fast time scale for opinion, and also slow time scale for value.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay.
Yeah, thanks.
There are also two separate variables in your model, right?
Sorry?
As you said, you have two separate variables for each of the value and opinion.
Yeah. Yeah, so you say two different values, and then value, that's a confusing element, which I also in the paper often happens. So in the end, I said numbers if I did not mean value in line with the definition, which minor point. So then you align your value with your neighbors very slowly. And then people may create new links to like-minded people. That's based on the opinions that people have. And then they might cut off links to people with a very different opinion. And you see here the 3 steps that have a star in them. They have an element of stochasticity, so they are probabilistic. So I think it's nice to now look at some pictures.
Yeah. So how do people change their values? You said it's not fixed, but it changes very slowly.
Yeah, so it's based on the neighbors. So the average value of all of the neighbors, they take a very small step in that direction from their own current value.
So there's a lot of memory with original.
Yeah.
Just,
It's kind of mutation.
Yeah,
no, but it's not instantaneous. So the opinion change is instantaneous or very fast.
Yeah,
And the
it can
value
jump
goes-
very rapidly, yeah, but the value is always indeed some memory. Yeah, that's a good point.
Also, you implement this in your rules, like, what is the rule you exactly put that they change their values over time? Like, how do you define the rules? The value changes this epsilon amount over time.
So over time, I calculate the average value of all the neighbors, and that's one scalar, and I take the current value that I have, and then I take a very small step in that direction.
But do you take the opinion or the value? The opinion.
No, this is for the value, and for the opinion, it's basically based on the Ising spin model. So I generate a random new opinion, and then I look if that suits better in the model than the original.
What is the opinion, what's the influence of the opinion on the value? That's not so.
It doesn't have a direct link, but I create the new links and I sever old links based on opinions, and then those links may affect the values. So that's where they interact.
Okay, so the network or the neighbors depend on the opinion. That's
Yeah.
it. Okay.
Yeah.
So what does this mean that value is a continuous variable? I mean, because the opinions are plus and minus one,
So the opinions are also continuous.
are also continuous. Ah,
Both are continuous.
and this is, so for this, wouldn't it for these values make sort of more sense to not just look at your direct neighbors, but some sort of more of a, instead of also having a larger spatial scale, or is that just something for future work? And
Yeah, it's actually in my slide for future work. I like the idea. I did not implement it in this model yet. Also, at some point, so many things were going on. So when I first explained this model to Patrick, one of the co-authors, he asked me like, did you just build a random number generator here? And so I wanted to avoid people asking me that question, so make it a little bit limited. I think I did not create a random number generator, so I will show you some pictures later on that have some explainable patterns. And I think from there, it's nice to add these things, but I didn't want to do it all at first. But it is a nice idea, yeah. So in all the simulations that I will show you today, I always started with a random network. So
Wait, so just for my clarification, this is kind of like a DEF1 model with dynamic Ising weights.
yeah, and then the values are different from the.
Is XY, XY is -1 on the.
Yeah, but XY contains a cosine, right? Like it's a
Yeah.
limit of infinite n, you get like a continuous circle.
Yeah,
But this is still Ising, so it's still a product, so it's an AND operator.
but the values are between -1 and 1, it's not 0 and 1.
Yeah, so it's like an Ising with like weights
Yeah.
that are dynamic over time.
Yeah.
I'm assuming. And then like the opinions are like kind of like a DEF1 model where you take an average and then move towards the average.
But those variables are continuous.
Yeah, but this is also continuous. I mean, within a bound.
Most variables, so the opinions and the values here are continuous variables.
Yeah, but if you have an Ising model with weights, I
Yeah.
mean, yeah, it becomes continuous. I mean, an energy function would help here, I guess.
I don't completely understand what you mean, but I don't know if it helps what happened here.
Is there an energy function or I mean, your update rule is?
Yeah, there is some sort of energy function. We didn't call it energy in the end. The reviewers didn't like that. So what did we call it?
Utility function? No.
I think alignment,
Yeah.
something like that, or balance, imbalance, we call it. So you want to minimize the imbalance that people experience. Yeah, and based on that, And based on the temperature, you either accept a new opinion or you reject a new opinion. So that's basically the rule of the Ising model.
So you can really do statistical mechanics. That is what we were trying to do, no?
Yeah.
It's not so clear. So sometimes if you have dynamical rules, if they, for example, don't obey detailed balance, then there's no hope for it.
I think it's going to be very hard to do to really give analytical solutions, mostly because also this creation of new links and no, actually first the step of the values and the opinions, they're already, I do not do it on all of them. I choose an X number of individuals, and this parameter is also very important, and they relate to the rates in which people can update their opinion and the values. And I also think that this value factor, as well as the opinion factor, will make it very hard to give any analytical solutions. I don't know how to do that.
Because they are very different, but at least try to, is it possible to write down a partition function?
Yeah, I'm not sure what you mean with the partition function, but like this imbalance, like the energy function in the Eisenstein model, this you can write down. Yeah.
Right. But if you do the Ising model, you create a new configuration, and then you can see what the probability of this configuration, because it has to obey the Boltzmann distribution.
Yeah.
That's statistical mechanics. Okay, but here you're not doing it this way, no? So you're not having the same type of probability. I mean, it's a question.
Yeah, I do. So based on the new opinion, I can calculate this imbalance that is related to how much, so the imbalance will be higher when neighbors have very different opinions. So the system kind of tries to lower this imbalance by allowing people, if the random flip lowers this imbalance, so that it's better aligned in the network, then I accept the new flip always. And if it increases the imbalance, then I accept it with a certain probability that depends on the imbalance that it creates.
Yeah, okay, but there,
And
that's the problem. So not a problem, but that's the question. Is that imbalance equation, is that similar to a Boltzmann effect?
Yes.
Okay.
I think it's a bit more tricky because the network is continuously changing.
Yes.
So
This is what I.
That's what I want to ask.
So I'm not sure the Hamiltonian that she gets, I'm not sure is actually the Hamiltonian that characterizes national distribution, because the thing is continuously changing. It looks like it's something that at some point in the network life, it has a certain value. But it will have a different value like when the network change at the next step.
Yeah.
They call it.
And then we have to separate.
So there is a Markov chain, but it's a time-dependent process, and I don't know if you can define the stationary distribution very easily.
But for a certain choice of your network, you do have.
Yes.
So you could just do it very slowly, do the first piece of optimization with each network, and then do the.
So then, so that's, you use that sort of, I think it's a metropolis 18 and now for the opinions.
Yeah.
The links also have a Boltzmann weight factor, or it's
No, it's the creation of new.
because it's also probabilistically accepted, but there's
Yeah.
no sort of like temperature for the links.
No.
I think it's like a chemical coordination kind of thing, like because you put in the number of links change over time.
Yeah.
And if that's true, then you have just a normal partition function approach. So there should be a stationary.
Yeah, I think so. There should be one.
Dan kun je er dan aan komen.
That could be good. All right.
Yeah. Thank you. So the output that I created, so I started with a random network and also random uniformly distributed opinions and values. And then here I depict the opinions at the final states of the network. And then sometimes I saw that it reached a consensus, as you see on the left. And sometimes the system became polarized, as you see on the right. So I did not distinguish between how many groups it would split into. If it was 2 or 3 or 4 groups, it was all polarized.
Sorry, this is all for the same parameter settings. these 6 figures? Or?
No, but
Ah.
later on I will show you that sometimes under the same parameter settings, you can see different things. But this one is a bit particular. So in the middle, I identified a third state, which I call the coexistent state. And like a human eye would maybe split this up into different states. But the way that I quantified it grouped it together because the opinion distribution is quite similar in these two situations. And in the coexistence states, we see that many opinions are still present, but the network is still connected. And then
the color code is what?
the opinions. Yeah.
So, can I also ask, so this one on the bottom, it is kind of stable?
No, it's actually not very stable. So this happens if the temperature is very high. So here we're looking at a random, almost a random network.
Can you drop a phase space like following the parameters, or it's not feasible?
Well, I will show you some sensitivity analysis where I change the parameters over time. So it's not exactly a phase space, but we will.
Actually, how many parameters did you change? Like,
Yeah.
two is the values, I don't know what, I think what I will do is for example, the coupling constant. What is it here that we changed?
I will get there in a couple of slides. Yeah, thanks. I can actually also go there now. So in our global sensitivity analysis, we changed a long list of parameters. The most important ones that I also want to focus on now, so the top 6, those I also explored in a one factor at a time sensitivity analysis. So the first one that also came out of this global sensitivity analysis was this temperature. So it's the numbers from a palm sensitivity analysis, it's not based on variance, so they do not add up to 1, but they do show a kind of importance of the parameter on a certain state. So 0.19 is a lot higher than the other numbers in this row. So that means that the temperature is quite important to determine whether or not the system becomes polarized.
Temperature in your setting is what exactly one of the processes in the list of the model description?
Yeah, so it's the stochasticity, so the probability of accepting an opinion, even though that opinion.
So it's kind of accepting and deviating.
Yeah. Yeah.
So it's like the Boltzmann factor.
Yeah.
Yes, I would just call it decision error. Instead of temperature.
What would you call it?
Decision error.
Decision error, okay, yeah. So we also see that the temperature is very important for the coexistence state. So that relates to this random network, right? So if the temperature is very high, we expect a random network, and that has a high, that is a coexistence state. And the trans opinion change is basically how many agents I allow to update their opinion in every time step. The maximum number of neighbors, it's the maximum number of neighbors that an agent may have. The probability of changing a link, that's the probability of cutting off a link or creating a new link. I always put that to the same values in the simulations that I show you today. The distance of removing a link, so it's from which opinion distance I will cut off the link. And the distance of cognitive dissonance is the dist-CV. So that's for which value will I move away my opinion actively from my neighbor. I think this is a little bit messy to really go into now, but I will show you some graphs of these individual parameters, and then it will hopefully make more sense.
Then I can ask you what the number is exactly represent here.
Yeah, so it's the relative importance of the different parameters.
Relative.
No, so it's not varying great because some of the parameters were categorical, so we couldn't do a standard global sensitivity analysis.
So what does it mean that if T is 0.15 and 0.19? Then do I have to compare these numbers
To each other. So when we see a 0.03 and a 0.09, then the 0.09 is 3 times as important but it doesn't add up to one.
So, but how do you measure importance? Because you have three different states, so do you measure whether before, so for example, in the polarized state, do you change the temperature and then look whether when the polarized state disappears?
Yeah, yeah, so that's why they are different for the three states. Because it just measured what is the probability of seeing a polarized state or not, and what is the probability of seeing a coexistent state or not. So that's why it's different for the three columns. So for the global sensitivity analysis, all the other parameters also change throughout the analysis. But I did a one factor at a time analysis, so then I really only change one parameter and all the others are at a default value. And I think that helps to get some intuition as to what's going on. So the way that we should interpret this figure is that on the horizontal axis is a parameter, in this case it's the temperature. And on the vertical axis is the probability of the different states. So if I look maybe at a temperature of 0.25, then around 50% of my simulations ended up in the consensus state and around 50% ended up in the polarized state. And then you see that for this temperature, if it gets too high, all the simulations end up in a coexistent state. So that's in line with what we expect. And what we thought was quite interesting is that this consensus happens at intermediate values for the temperature. And the idea there is, of course, that if the system is kind of moving into a polarized state, but then there is some random agents that flip over, then they can pull the two groups together, and that helps to avoid the polarized state and to end up in a consensus state. So some stochasticity helps to avoid polarization. And if we want to relate this to the real world, it could mean that people update their opinion not based on their network. So if you update your opinion because you think very hard or because you read a newspaper or anything that's not related to your network, that would be modeled as stochasticity here.
I'm a little bit confused because normally stochasticity is actually caused by temperature. If you have a higher temperature, you have more stochastic behavior.
Yeah.
So how do you think about that here? You decouple these two things.
No, it's exactly that.
But you have, but what is on the y-axis here?
The probability of the different states. So on the left, we see that, so that means that at a low temperature, almost all simulations end up in a polarized state. And then as the temperature increases from 0 to, let's say, 0.4, we see increasing amounts of consensus as the final configuration of the network. So if we add stochasticity, we see more consensus.
That's some point.
I'm having trouble interpreting this. I thought this was like a phase diagram that you have two parameters.
No,
And the blue one is where you have consensus. So
no. So the vertical axis is
so why
not.
is it then colored? Why is it not just a line? I'm sorry, I'm asking you.
I could have drawn 3 lines as well. I experimented a little bit. In the networks where I tried this seemed to be the most intuitive, but I'm sorry if it's
The y-axis tells the fraction of that.
yeah.
The fraction, oh, okay,
Yeah.
it's like a fractional, okay, now I
Yeah.
understand, okay.
Yeah, thanks. It's important. Yeah.
Can I ask you something? This is so these are different initial configurations of your network because you initialize it uniformly, randomly, whatever. And so some of these simulations actually end up in a polarized state. Some of them end up in a consensus state. Does that mean really that the system has different attractors, or is this the fact that you actually find a mix of consensus and polarization due to the actually the algorithm that you used to classify the end states? Because you haven't said how you actually classify consensus and polarization. And I can imagine that you use an algorithm that actually has introduced some classification in the boundary shifts.
Yeah. Yeah, so the algorithm that I used is based on the distribution of opinions in the final network. But I also made visualizations. So I saved all the final networks and I did a visual check by eye to make sure that the algorithm was doing what I wanted it to do. And I trust the algorithm.
Do you always run these on random initial conditions, or did you start, let's say, for polarized site and then also had the same effect?
So in this figure, I always started with random initial conditions.
Did you check the dependencies of your final condition on your initial condition? Because in the bottom model, the fraction of the fraction of plus or minus at the end in the station state is the same as the initial one. So maybe you should check that.
Yeah, maybe I did not check that. I do think that
Further model deterministic, right?
is not I mean, there is no rewiring, that's for sure.
Yeah, but you also
But
copy
it's-
the state, right?
Yeah, but maybe there is also dependency on the initial state because the rules are very similar in some sense. So
there could be a
I'm not
dependency.
saying exactly the same thing, but maybe some like average.
Yeah. I think for the patterns that we see, it doesn't matter so much, but especially in the kind of bistable range, I could check this.
But did you also check when you started the same state, if you get the same distribution?
Yeah, so running multiple simulations from the same initial state. And sometimes that also ended up in different states. Yeah, so there
But
seems
you-
to be multiple factors. So because of the stochasticity in the internal dynamics.
But that gives a different picture than this one, probably.
I'm not sure. I did not make this figure with one fixed initial condition. Yeah, so I'm not sure.
So if I start in a consensus state, then I crank up the temperature. What happens, when I, do I lose the consensus at the boundary between the purple and the orange? Or no?
So you mean if you are maybe somewhere over here and then you increase
Yeah,
it?
crank up the temperature.
Yeah, at some point you will lose the consensus definitely.
Yeah.
For temperature.
But the question, of course, is there, because you suggest that there are alternative stable states or alternative states in your method, which to me can only arise if there's a kind of overlap between the states there. So
What do you mean with overlap? Because we see for a certain parameter value, there are two different possibilities, right? Or is that not what with overlap?
if you crank up, the boundary in the direction of the T is very sharp.
Yeah,
So it's like, yeah.
Maybe I can ask something to clarify. So in terms of the consent, like the classification happens by classifying the end distribution of opinions.
Yeah.
But consensus is the same as polarization, right? Within the group, you're completely in consensus and they're separated from the
Yeah.
graphs I saw before in
Yeah.
separate subgraphs.
yeah. So for the individuals, it maybe looks similar, but the density function of the probabilities in the whole population is different, of course, because in a polarized state you have 2 or 3 peaks.
Yeah, okay. Okay, yeah. So yeah, then I think what Anna is also asking, like this boundary seems very sharp. And you would expect a bit more like a continuous transition between these things because at some point you would have this mixing going on. But because we're looking at fractions, that's maybe the problem.
Yeah, and so it also depends on the parameter. So for different parameters, the figure looks different, but we somehow see that there are certain temperatures, like from 0.8 on. If it gets higher than that, then it's very hard to see anything other than coexistence.
Yeah, maybe as a suggestion, you could look at like the distribution of different opinions instead of the classification in this sense, because then you get a better sense of like.
But how would you want to do that? Because I have 200 simulations per. So then you look at a lot of at the entropy, yeah. So you had a.
Yeah, I was wondering, is it always possible to classify your solution into one of these three states? Aren't there also some sort of disordered states that do not fit nicely into one of these three cases, or is disordered coexistence?
Yeah, so disorder could also be coexistence. So a completely random network ends up in a coexistence state.
Do you also see like polarization where one is polarized and the other one is coexistent?
No. No, that's interesting. I haven't, of course, I haven't looked at the whole possible space of my parameters, but I've tried quite a lot and I've never seen that in this model.
You determine when your simulation is finished.
Either if it hadn't changed very much based on the PDFs of the opinions for, I think, 50 time steps, or after 3,000 time steps. And the 3,000 time steps was mostly determined for this high temperature case, because there, of course, it always changes, and I wanted to stop my simulation at some point.
I have something, a question about this high temperature limit, so I don't know if you already explained it, but if you go to 10 indeed, you see there's 10% possibility that it polarizes. Are you going to explain that? Because that sounds weird.
I don't know why that is happening there. That's a good question. And I
So
don't
it
know.
actually splits into separate parts, and then is it true that, this is what my previous question was, that if you, once you polarize and you have different, say, clubs or sets, they never join again? Can they actually rejoin?
They can, yeah. So if one of the individuals kind of at random shifts their opinion and then can create a new link to the other group, and that individual may then put the groups together, because then the groups reconnect. So this is weird. That might be misclassification, actually. I think it's quite likely that.
So what's your classification, your classifier? It's just, I would say, some cluster.
What are
And it's based on the probability function of the opinion. So if it has one clear peak and it's a low variance, it's a consensus. If it has multiple peaks, it's polarized. And if it is high variance with one or more peaks, it's coexistence.
But in your previous plot, I mean, you seem to suggest, if you, one magnet over here, there, yeah, these ones, it seems like polarized are always different clusters. Is that, so that's not the definition of polarized. You don't have to have different clusters.
Yeah, because you need to have multiple peaks in your opinion.
because these
Now, what does it need to have multiple peaks? I mean, on the left, you also have multiple.
On the left, you have only one peak in opinions. So if you make a histogram
because
of
continuous.
all your opinions, it's not just one peak. Everybody has the same.
Sorry, there's opinion, but
No,
the color was on
So the color nodes are the opinions, and if you would check the polarization, you would make a histogram, and there will be bimodal distribution of opinion.
Yeah.
Then you're
So it's a one-dimensional analysis of the opinion space.
Yes.
One-dimensional.
Yeah.
Okay, that's what.
and we could be that maybe for high temperature it has just a fluctuation, and then your algorithm traces it as a new mode in our
Yeah. Yeah, so in this coexistence state, that's also what you see here in the top, for example, there can be, of course, some peaks. So I had to tell the algorithm, like, when do we really say it's a different peak, and based on how deep the valley is. And there, that is where I expect some misclassification.
Why didn't you use the connectedness in the network?
Yeah, this is my yeah. I thought you actually meant that.
Yeah, probably I could have done that, although then between the consensus and coexistence, it's harder to measure.
Yeah, I mean both, yeah.
Yeah, you could of course make combinations. At some point I thought some misclassification is not that important to me to make my point, but it depends of course also a little bit on your question and your field. I know physicists, they like very small error bars, and biologists are okay with a little bit larger error bars, but
also that allows you to have a very connected society with polarization if you don't use it.
Yeah, in principle, yes. Although in my model, you would never see that. So if it's very closely connected, you wouldn't see two distinct groups. But the algorithm could give this in principle because it only looks at the opinions and not at the network structure. Yeah.
And the opinions here were binned probably, right? So to create these graphs for the classification of the different groups.
Yeah.
And the binning was the same?
Yeah.
Okay.
How am I doing in time? Okay. So this is the graph for the probability of changing a link. So it should be interpreted in the same way. So on the vertical axis, we have the probability of the different states. And then we see that if agents do not really want to change their links, so they don't want to cut off links or create new links, then we end up in a consensus state. And that, of course, relates to the initial network that I started with. So I always started with a random network, which was fully connected. And so on a fully connected network, you end up in a consensus state. And then as people more rapidly change their links, then it's more likely to get into a polarized state. Also here, the default temperatures, it's indicated with a dashed line. So also for the temperature, you see that my default value was quite low. And the orange, so the coexistence state, did not occur very often. So I think that this coexistence state that I showed you, which was not the random coexistence state, but the structured coexistence state, is actually a transient state. So that relates to your question about the stopping criteria. I think if I increase that, at some point, the coexistence state might disappear or get even smaller. I also think that is quite interesting because in the real world, I think we often see something more like a coexistence state. So I know that people have applied these opinion dynamics models to some real world data, but they're mostly based on Twitter, for example, and there we see a lot of polarization. And then models that also create a lot of polarization, they match the data quite nicely. But if you look at data not from Twitter, I actually think that the coexistence state is more realistic. So I think it's quite interesting that this model, but also almost all other models that I saw that are describing opinion dynamics, they almost never find this coexistence state. The last parameter that I want to emphasize is this distance of cognitive dissonance. And that's mostly because I thought it would be very important in determining polarization. And so I was expecting that if I would kind of not take this into account, so the distance of cognitive dissonance means the value distance from where agents will diverge their opinions. So the default, it was 1. So that means that if I run into an agent which has a value which is more than 1 of the distance from my own value, then I will diverge my opinion. And I thought that this divergence of opinions was very important to get polarization. And if I would get rid of this process, everything would end up in a consensus state. But I actually found that if this parameter is set to 2, so that's the maximum distance that agents can have. So that basically means that they always align their opinion, right? So I'm not taking into account the cognitive dissonance anymore. And then I see that still half of the simulations end up in the polarized state. So it's actually not the most important parameter. And the network structure actually seems more important in that sense. So this probability of changing a link that really goes from almost all simulations ending up in consensus to almost no simulations. Whereas this distance of cognitive dissonance it has some effect and also in a direction that we were expecting, but not as strong as we were expecting.
But for low temperature, right?
Yes.
Okay, yeah.
And I mean, that depends obviously also on all the other settings.
Yes.
So if you would go to the probability of making these links that you showed before, a very low value, this might look completely different.
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah.
Sorry, can you tell again what this is? Because you said you just draw a random opinion and then you look at the average of your neighbors, right?
Yeah.
So when do you compare values and change your opinion by that? Is that another So what was this?
Yeah, so so it's in this imbalance that I calculate. So I choose an agent and then I change the opinion at random. And then based on the values and the opinions of the neighbors, I calculate the imbalance. And the imbalance is then, I try to, the imbalance is low if I have an opinion that's similar to neighbors with a similar value, but different from neighbors with a different value.
Oh, so you don't really look at the average of the neighbor. It's like a weighted average by their value difference with you.
And when you cut the link, so you cut it to, cut all the links to agents with opinion that's that much different from your own opinion?
No, so I chose an X number of agents at random. I think the default value was 10. And then for those 10 individuals, I look at the neighbors.
Okay.
So I want to move to the conclusions. So based on those three figures, we can see that consensus happens when you rather change your opinion and change your friends, which also makes sense. And you do not actively change your opinion away from your friends. So this is the cognitive dissonance. So even though it was not the most important parameter, the direction was in line with this statement. And for intermediate levels of stochasticity. But I think more importantly, and this relates a bit to the point that André made, that we see that there are multiple outcomes with equal parameter settings. So the system is unpredictable. And I think this is not really new for sociologists, of course, they know this. So if we try to explain populism in the Netherlands, then this one individual case could just be kind of an outlier of one simulation. But then if you look at the whole of Europe, then suddenly we can say something about a trend. So this is not really news for sociologists, but I think it is news for some newspaper articles where people try to explain what we see, which is happening, based on where we came from or based on a set of rules, but it might actually be unpredictable.
Can I ask you a question about that? Because what does it exactly mean? Notable outcomes with equal parameters? I mean, of course you get multiple outcomes in a certain system, but you can still say something about probability of the outcome.
Yes, yeah.
So when you say it's unpredictable in terms of stochastics or statistics and probabilities, it might be very predictable.
Yeah, that's true.
Okay.
But one particular simulation.
Sure.
Yeah. So I have some ideas for kind of small research projects, kind of in the order of magnitude of a master thesis. Like how can you move from one state into another one? And what tools would policymakers have for this? So if the system is polarized, can you target a certain set of individuals to maybe move into a consensus state or vice versa? And I think that there the role for values in this model is very important because they kind of maintain the status quo because they move so slowly. But if the system is stuck in a polarized state for a long time, then the values will really also have converged in different groups. And then it might be quite hard to get out of that. I'm interested to explore if there are crucial moments within the process where it's easier or harder to intervene. And that relates to the pathways, how we get into polarization and how we get into consensus. And of course, I would especially like to detect these moments before they are happening, so that you do not say like, oh, 3 years ago we had a window of opportunity, but you could say, hey, in 6 months there will be a window of opportunity. And last, I would be interested to explore what happens when we produce broader information. So that was also the question that you asked. So like the enemy of my enemy is my friend, or the enemy of my friend is my enemy, things like that. That can also lead to quite interesting dynamics. Yeah. For a more larger scale research project that I'm thinking about, and it links also to a lot of expertise that we have at the Copernicus Institute. So that's about cost-benefit analysis for climate mitigation strategies. And right now, these cost benefit analysis are mostly done with optimization models or equilibrium models for the cost benefit analysis. But I think it might change quite a lot if we take into account the support that you would have for this in a community. And then a model like this might help a little bit. So then also we can distinguish between the actual costing changes in GDP and also with the perceived cost. And I would be then especially interested in looking at the different scales or different regions of things. So sometimes one group of people might actually pay the cost and the benefits might be given to another group of people. And of course, that's really where policymakers sometimes lose support for their policies. So yeah, I think with a model like this in combination of cost benefit analysis might be quite interesting, but that's more long-term and a bit of a bigger project. That was what I wanted to share. Thank you very much.
Already there were a lot of questions. Are there any more questions or?
I was wondering, did you think about what would happen if values and opinions are multidimensional, because you can have opinions on different subjects?
Yeah, I thought about that and we had quite some conversations and then we decided to leave that for future work. So I didn't explore it in my model, but I think it would be a cool next step. And then I also think that, like, if on one opinion you create some clusters, then actually the values might align. And then when there's a topic of a different opinion, it might kind of be put on the original network. And I think maybe we also saw something like that after COVID. So there were maybe some different groups that were talking more to each other. And then the Ukraine war happened. And you saw that it kind of, there were some correlations with the original networks that were formed. But of course, I didn't do any data-driven analysis for this. This is just by talking to other people, thinking. Yeah.
Okay, as a bit of technical, you showed these results in one factor at a time sensitivity analysis. But how about interaction effects? Is this something that you use this palm analysis? Does it also allow you to study interaction effects similar to Sobel indices, or is that
not as nicely as with Sobel? So it's a bit hard to interpret, but I can show you. So this is the output from the palm, where you see combinations of different parameters, and here I show you the figure for the polarized state. Where I think the clearest result is in this combination of maximum number of neighbors and the temperature, where we see a kind of really a pattern where there's a kind of synergy between the two parameters, that when the maximum number of neighbors is high, then for larger temperatures we still see a high probability of the polarized state. So there are some things going on here, but it's a little bit hard to really look at these higher order effects. So I also did some analysis where I changed parameters in a more structured way. So this was for the 3 parameters that the palm said were the most important in analysis. So this is the maximum number of neighbors, the temperature, and the number of times agents could change their opinion. And then if the trice opinion change is low, then we see that the consensus does not happen as often. Yeah, you also see synergy effects kind of. And then for high temperatures, we see more consensus in general. For low number of when the maximum number of neighbors is very low, we see more coexistence. That also relates to when people cannot really talk to each other. Of course, there's many opinions present in the model. Does that answer the question?
Yeah, I'm just curious whether these interaction effects can be studied. So that's
yeah, it is a bit hard.
Methods,
yeah.
There was one question there.
Yeah, I'm still a little bit hazy on how values and opinions interact with each other. So if I look at these graphs and I look at one slice, so that's the probability mass function that says that, some percentage of your simulation is resulted at the end in consensus, some percentage ended in coexistence, and so on, right? Is that correct?
Yeah.
Now, is this quenched or any on the values?
What do you mean?
So are you fixing your model of the values and then doing a simulation, or is everything changing simultaneously?
Everything's changing. So in time, the values are also changing, but
So
very
how do the
slowly.
values and opinions interact? Is
So
there a mathematical model that you can find?
yeah, I don't have it on my slides, but it is published now in the Journal of Artificial Societies and Social Simulations. So there you can they use this ODD protocol, so there all the information can be found. But the basic idea is that the values affect the opinions by this cognitive dissonance. So if the values are too far apart, then people diverge their opinion, and if the values are coming together, people align their opinion.
Is this like a deterministic relationship, or is it like probability?
That itself is deterministic, but then there is a stochasticity in that sometimes people also change their opinion, even though it doesn't align with that rule. And opinions affect the values by changing the network structure. So that's where the interactions are found.
Yeah, I had a very similar question. About the update of the dynamics of the, so you already said that is the difference between the opinion, and I'll ask you during the talk, there was some memory effect indeed. But what actually, which parameter does determine that memory effect, or how, I mean, we didn't discuss this, and I can imagine that this is a very important parameter. Is there, so if you would have zero coupling between opinions and values, nothing would change, of course. So the way that you, how fast you react to a value on the opinion, that is going to be very important. Is that something that you looked at? Which one is that?
Yeah, so that's the rate value change and the tries value change. So the tries is how many agents are going into that procedure, and the rate is how big is the step. And we see that it's actually based on the palm, it's not a very important parameter in determining this outcome.
It also depends on the time scales. Sorry.
Right, exactly.
Like you said, we do 3,000 time steps, but if 3,000 time steps is small compared to this step, then it just means that if you simulate 10 times longer, that you will get completely different. Because so again, also about questions like, how do you know that your system has equilibrated? But then you also check this for the value dynamics. Are the values?
The values are not in equilibrium. No.
So this means that if you would simulate 10 times longer, that your picture would maybe look completely different.
Exactly,
No.
I mean, no.
Because I ran some simulations. Otherwise, I wouldn't have to say this. No, so once it is kind of stuck in a polarized state, then over time the opinions do not change anymore. So that means the network doesn't change anymore, and then just the values in one community they converge. Yeah.
And then so the time scale is not important then.
At that point, not. No.
But then we can ask the same about the consensus states. When you're in a consensus, how do you know how stable it is? Like,
yeah, so there I also ran some simulations for a longer time, and then I also see that if all the opinions have or all the agents have the same opinion, then the network stays connected, because then, at least in my default values, of course, so then this probability of changing a link, agents do not really go into that part of the model anymore, because the opinions are too close together to break up a link. So that means the network stays exactly the way it is, and that means that the values will just converge.
They will converge. So I didn't understand why you said the values are not in equilibrium. I mean, they should, in the end of your simulation, they should have some kind of stationary dynamics.
Yeah, but 3,000 steps wasn't always enough to get there.
Yeah. Okay.
But can I go on the question that I had on this, because I think it's an important point. So if you actually would instantaneously change your value to your opinion, so there's a very fast adjustment, would that not, then I would say the value aligns with the opinion, not immediately. Is that, what would be the, I mean, just as an extreme case, because that is like.
Yeah, it's a nice question. I can speculate, but I didn't try this, and I've also noticed that if I speculate for this model, sometimes I'm wrong, so don't take my word for it. But I expect that it depends a little bit on the probability of changing a link. But if they kind of instantly all align, then the system would just very quickly move to consensus.
So that is consensus.
Yeah, but if both of them, if there is some delay, maybe because the tri's opinion change, and also the tri's value change, or just the number of agents that may update their opinion and value over time. If that's low enough, then sometimes you might move into a polarized state. Because the agents in the initial state, sometimes they are connected even though they have a different opinion. And if those agents do not update their opinion at that time step, they might cut off the link.
Yeah, maybe I can add this for Peter. Like in a default model, which it seems like this value updating is doing, there's provable bounds that it will just go towards the average. So that seems to me like a community will form on some sort of network structure, and then it stays there, and then the opinions will just update.
Okay.
That's how it seems to me.
So you start every connection with random network, random opinions, but sort of social networks are not random, heterogeneous. Like some people are very connected, very influential, and others not, most not actually. So have you tried running this on initializing with other type of networks, and is it easier or harder to reach consensus? What are your findings?
Yeah, so I tried this a little bit, but mostly in the beginning, and I think I changed the model a little bit afterwards. At that point, I didn't find anything very interesting yet, but I didn't do a very systematic exploration. But I started with a skill-free network, I think, and with a small wave network and a random network. And I didn't see anything very interesting. But it could be that with the current model, actually, something would happen.
That would be this follow-up question, because you have you are in the middle, that part would need to follow the topology you want to preserve. So I don't know whether that is easy or not. Because the initial condition, you start random and Vault asks it, okay, you can start free, whatever, but after that you need to update your network.
Yeah.
And the update has to preserve the topology you want to keep. So that
you need to put some referential attachment in the
update. You have to buy the update.
Yeah, so that would really change the model quite fundamentally.
Yes.
Yeah, that's also a nice idea for small research projects. Yeah.
I was just thinking, so the values are based on the average of them.
Yeah.
So instead of an average, it's like, let's say a voting by formula, take the maximum. How would you do that out?
I don't know. Yeah, also a nice idea. You would see more fluctuations in the values. I'm not sure what exactly would happen. I didn't try that particular idea.
Would you expect everyone going to the next meeting?
I think so.
Yeah.
So, what I was interested in is, actually, I didn't see anywhere in your slides something about hysteresis. You always start from a random, from a random state, and then you look at the dynamics where you converge it. what if we are in a consensus state on, increased temperature? Do we see critical transition? And will lowering the temperature then keep us locked up in a kind of polarized state, or is it a more gradual change? Because I think from a point of view of like opinion dynamics in society, this would actually be an important issue to understand.
Yeah.
Rather than going into economic type of arguments, I think that whether or not we are locked in a certain state at some point, that is crucial information.
Yeah, I completely agree. I would like to explore this. I think it depends on the parameter also. For this temperature parameter, I do not expect hysteresis. Especially not from the consensus into the coexistence state, because that's just adding randomness until you look at a random network. And then if you take away randomness, at some point you will get a structure again. It's basically like starting from a random network and then you move into this consensus state. So this step from intermediate values of T to high values, I expect no hysteresis. For the other parameters, it might be there. In an initial version of the model, which was a lot smaller, I think for this for Trice opinion change, I tried to find some sort of bifurcation plot, and there it seemed to be present. But then once the model added in complexity, everything became a bit more smooth. I'm not sure how exactly if hysteresis is present in this model. But it is one of the ideas that I would like to explore in future projects. And I think it is quite doable.
Because I think that if you don't think about like what kind of potential outcomes do we have a kind of distribution of outcomes. But you classify part of that distribution as polarized and part of that consensus. But it's a more I think it's a more continuous type of change. It's not so black and white as you point out, like it's either consensus or polarized.
I think in one simulation it becomes either a consensus state or a polarized state. So one simulation
that
doesn't.
Sounds a lot like alternative dynamics, but if they occur for the same parameter, wouldn't you then also would that not immediately imply that we have somewhere a kind of hysteresis effect?
Yeah, maybe the physicists or mathematicians can answer that better than me. I think if you can map it into an ODE system, definitely yes.
But I think this goes back to the whole question of statics and dynamics, because you are focusing on a dynamical model, which is what's fine, it gives nice results. But the underlying questions that we started with in the beginning already, is there an energy function that actually gives us the long-term stationary distribution of this model? I think that's a very important question to analyze these kind of questions. Right. Because if you have such an energy function, then you can ask how does the local stability of phase space changes when you start changing some parameters, and then you have these things like hysteresis, and you get all these effects.
But in the imbalance, where the imbalance got minimized, that's what you said.
Of course that is on both particular networks. So at the next point in time, when the network changes, then the imbalance function itself may also change. It will.
For me, it's not even clear if there is what is called a detailed balance rule, for example. When you, is this system inherently out of equilibrium, or is this system really obeying a conservative force field that you can in some sort of configuration space, and the configuration space is clear, but how it actually what the equivalent energy function is that it conveys is not so. That's what I think is the question. Because I mean, if you, what do I mean by detailed balance rule? Different detailed balance rule. Well, if you, for example, make one change in one direction more likely than a change in another direction, and whereas the underlying distribution should be a Boltzmann distribution or this temperature distribution, then you force the system into, well, maybe the wrong direction. And if this is not balanced, then you don't have a stationary solution. Well, you maybe do have a stationary solution, but not the equilibrium. I mean, it's kind of a semantics here, but I think these are important questions.
Yeah. Yeah, I agree.
For the model.
Yeah.
Not so much for the application.
Could give a feedback in a question. It's very interesting that it's continuous, but also it's not clear how then to label, because there are multiple tests to see if the distribution is bimodal or not, if the two modes are close or not. So there are so many degrees of freedom that perhaps a way just to fix this definition or to make it more.
I realize now that in this route I should have added equations and more precise information. And when I presented this before, I had a lot of descriptions about what it means for the real world, and that's not happening so much now. But it's very interesting for me. But yeah, so this is a good point. Next time.
Yeah, and then comes the question, because like if your final result change if you change the joists,
yeah,
like how much it changes, like when you change the joist, let's say, oh, it's polarized and bimodal and the modes are far away X, or if you change this X, how change your final result?
Yeah, so of course how I make the groups that really depends. I did try different things, and then like by eye I decided on which method I liked in the end. So I know that I agree quite well with the current algorithm. Of course, I didn't check all the 1,000 networks, but I checked a couple of hundred, and then I agree with the algorithm. So yeah, that is one way of going about it. But I also understand that for you it may help to see the equations that I actually use. Yeah.
Okay, so I think it was a nice discussion.
Yeah, very nice.
Yeah, if there are no more questions, we should thank those once again.